Hello everyone. In 1815, a Congress of ambassadors from all main European powers gathered in Vienna, Austria, to reorganize Europe. For almost 25 years, the continent had been at war. A series of wars that started shortly after the French Revolution and reached a never-seen-before intensity. From Portugal to Russia, all these years of battles and armies moving across the continent had devastated the land, killed hundreds of thousands, and shaken the thrones of well-established dynasties like the Habsburgs in Austria, the Romanovs in Russia, or the Hohenzollerns in Prussia. The kings of France, the Bourbons, had lost their throne for a generation and had just taken it back, at least for now. But the one man whose name and legacy had to be erased by this conference was obviously absent. He had been sent into exile, far away to the southern Atlantic, a prison he would never come back from. His name had already been added to the short list of legendary conquerors. He was admired or hated. He had had one of the most meteoric rises ever seen, followed by a spectacular downfall, and his first name would stay attached to this age of chaos that just ended. Napoleon. Tonight we're going to explore these 25 years that saw the rise and fall of Napoleon. What happened? Who was he? We will follow him from his birthplace in Corsica to Italy, to Egypt, to Paris. We will also talk about politics and diplomacy, society at the time of the French Revolution, warfare in the early 19th century. We will follow Napoleon across the battlefields of Europe until the collapse of his dreams of domination. And I will tell you about the aftermath of Napoleonic Wars that marked the rest of the century, from their impact on European regimes to the redrawing of frontiers or the rise of new powers like Great Britain and Prussia, the predecessor to unified Germany. So we have a lot to explore. As always, all you have to do is just let me guide you and relax. You may close your eyes at any time, because you won't need visual supports to follow along. And if you fall asleep, there are timestamps in the first comment or on your screen to help you resume the story. You can also download this story in audio or video format from my Patreon page, together with dozens more, if you decide to support the channel. And if that suits you better, you can listen to my stories on streaming platforms like Spotify or Apple Music. The links are in the first comment too. Now take one single deep breath and exhale slowly. Gently release the tension in your shoulders, your arms, your legs, even in your fingers that may be slightly contracted. we are going to travel back in time more than 200 years ago, and our journey begins right now. What are the Napoleonic Wars? Technically, they are a series of conflicts that pitted the French Empire and its allies against several coalitions of other European powers, to which the main participants were Great Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia. But wars began on a large scale in Europe before that. As soon as the French Revolution began in 1789, it was met with worries and hostility from other European countries, at least from their governments. First, because it was a threat to the traditional political order. Across continental Europe, kingdoms in the 18th century were mainly autocracies. They had hereditary dynasties of kings with different legal systems and rules and different sets of rights for their sovereigns. But the one thing this order was based on was a very extended royal power and a society of castes that was determined by birthright, depending on your social origin, your occupation, or the region where you were born. Your rights and duties could be very different from other inhabitants of the same kingdom. But the acceptance of this social order, in which members of the aristocracy were strongly privileged, and the power of the rulers had few checks, this was diminishing. There were occasional revolts of peasants when harvests were bad or when new taxes were raised, but this phenomenon had existed for a long time. Now, even a wealthier class of educated people, some of them very wealthy, and sometimes even wealthier than the aristocrats, because many new fortunes had appeared in the 18th century, were critical of these regimes that limited their liberties, not just their political liberties, their economic liberties too. The ideas developed by philosophers along the 18th century had infused a growing educated population from the bourgeoisie, but also parts of the aristocracy or the clergy that had turned critical of society. Across Europe, and with varying degrees, the disconnect between the regimes, the traditions, and parts of the population created tensions of a new kind. The only large country in Europe that was not too much shaken by this discomfort was Great Britain, because in the UK the society had already evolved towards an equalization of rights and a constitutional monarchy. Kings had more power than they have today, but political power had already shifted to a parliament. On top of this underlying unrest in European kingdoms, the governments were constantly faced with funding issues that weakened them. The states were in a process of centralization and took on more and more responsibilities. They had to pay for permanent armies and navies, an interior police. They sponsored manufactures or large public works, which was a drain on their budgets and forced them to borrow money. As soon as there was a war, the deficit could rocket up and new taxes had to be raised. So fiscal pressure was constantly rising, fueling discontent, all the more that the aristocracy and the church didn't pay taxes. So governments took the money where they could find it. They had to tax the rest of the population, generally more modest people. They taxed goods that came in or went out, or they made their colonies pay through direct taxes or taxes on trade. In no small part, for example, the revolt of the 13 colonies in America was triggered by taxation of trade and the way the British restricted free trade in their own colonies for economic and financial reasons. The poverty of governments contrasted with the relative wealth of their population. The 18th century was a period of economic growth, and as I told you earlier, many new fortunes based on trade, manufactures, or banking had appeared. This was only for a very small part of the population. The vast majority were still peasants and owned very little. But entire regions like France, Great Britain, Germany, the north of Italy, the Netherlands, had grown significantly wealthier along the century. Still, the main source of wealth was agriculture, and a good 80% of the population produced food or agricultural products. There were no big surpluses of grain and other foods, so bad harvests were still feared, because all countries were never more than 12 months away from a shortage of food in case of bad weather. Now, the French Revolution was the product of all these risks to the existing order, converging at the same time. The insatisfaction with the regime and society at large, the near bankruptcy of the state that could no longer fund itself without big reforms and had to impose heavier and heavier taxes on a part of the population. The existence of alternative models too, like the British constitutional monarchy or the American Republic. And on top of that, bad harvests that made the price of bread rise to unbearable levels. When it started, in 1789, all royal courts across Europe were shocked, but they recognized immediately what was happening. In Madrid, in St. Petersburg, in Vienna, in Berlin, they quickly understood that one of their worst nightmares was actually happening in France. Autocratic kings feared not only for their prerogatives or their thrones, the worries were broader because it was the entire social order that they stood for, that they represented, that was now threatened. At first, it was not too bad yet, because the revolutionaries of 1789 only turned France into a constitutional monarchy, something close to and actually inspired by the English model. This dramatically limited the power of the king, Louis says, but he was kept as head of state. Other autocracies in Europe, especially Austria and Prussia, were hostile to this revolution, but war didn't start immediately. And it is actually the revolutionary French Assembly that declared it on Austria and Prussia in 1792, in front of the preparations for war that these countries were making, and also because the revolution was in the process of turning more radical. In September of the same year, the monarchy was abolished and a republic was proclaimed, which was horrifying to hereditary monarchies across Europe. In 1793, the following year, the situation quickly turned almost desperate for the French Republic. On the one hand, it was attacked from all sides by its neighbors, and on top of that, there were internal revolts that supported the return to the monarchy. In response, the Republican Assembly called for a massive, total mobilization to fight its enemies, internal and external. This period was called the Terror because of the repression and large-scale executions that took place. Probably the most violent phase of the French Revolution, but it did wonders for the young republic. Externally, invaders were repelled on all fronts, and revolutionary armies advanced even beyond the frontiers. Internally, the majority of royalist revolts were suppressed at a huge human cost, but efficiently, and in 1794-1795 it appeared that this young French Republic was in a much better place. It was now on the offensive, and the situation of internal chaos had been mostly sorted out. Just 1 year before, in 1793, the port of Toulon on the Mediterranean Sea in the south of France had revolted, a royalist revolt, and the insurgents had called English and Spanish forces to their rescue. Both countries were happy to oblige, and they sent ships and troops. The port was besieged and retaken by the French Revolutionary Army, and a very young artillery captain from Corsica, Napoleon Bonaparte, was noticed for his efficient contribution to the siege. Like for many officers from the small nobility like him, or ordinary people that had embraced the revolutionary side, opportunities for a quick rise in the army didn't lack. High-ranking positions prior to the revolution were held by aristocrats who had deserted. For the majority of them, they had gone into exile or been arrested. For an entire generation of soldiers and low-ranking officers, there was a once-in-a-lifetime occasion to rise and replace them thanks to their merits or their connections. Bonaparte had both, as we will see later, and the following years would be very fastuous for him. But not just for him. A generation of military commanders that became highly skilled and trained during these years of continuous warfare also emerged, and the ones who survived participated later in the Napoleonic Wars as his generals. All of them rather ordinary people who were not destined to very high functions in the old order, and turned the revolution into a personal opportunity. Names like Davout, Lannes, or Ney. In 1795, France had invaded the Austrian Netherlands, that corresponded approximately to modern Belgium. Belgium did not exist yet. And then they had pushed to the north, to the Dutch Republic, that had been turned officially into a sister republic. But what sister meant here was more a satellite or a puppet state. At this point, the war had changed from a mostly defensive conflict at the beginning into a war of invasion. So why this reversal? First, because they could. The coalition against France was lacking coordination. France had been able to raise a bigger and more efficient army than any of its opponents. When the war had started, many countries in the coalition had an opportunistic approach. They hoped to benefit from a temporary weakness of France to take territories they had their eyes on, and they counted on a quick victory to secure a profitable operation for them. The French monarchy would be restored. This would make an example of what happened to countries that revolted against the traditional order, and as a bonus, they would gain territorial or financial advantages. Except the expected victory never came, and after 3 years, it was starting to look like a disaster, especially for Austria. The French had repelled Austrian armies that had performed quite poorly, and now they were marching towards Austria on two different axes, one through Germany and the other through the north of Italy, with an army commanded by a certain General Bonaparte. There were other reasons to this French expansionism. There was the theory that bringing the revolution to other countries would free them and secure allies in this new international order. And there were also less respectable reasons for war. War was advantageous. It was a factor of internal stability because it mobilized the population and distracted from internal troubles. Politically, it gave more power to the government and the National Assembly. And also it was profitable. Assets could be seized abroad and sold or exploited. This question of economy, finance, and property is also important to understand the Napoleonic years that would come later. The French Revolution was not just about human rights and a change in the regime. The new French Republic presided over a massive economic and social change in the 1790s. First, all privileges had been abolished, meaning that, at least on paper, everyone was a citizen, and all citizens had equal rights. The Catholic Church had been stripped of all its privileges too, like tax exemptions, and its properties had been confiscated, together with assets taken to aristocrats in exile or to the ex-crown. These formed the bulk of a gigantic pool of assets called the national assets that the government auctioned to whomever could buy them: land, forests, building, furniture. Many of them generated income from their exploitation or because they were rented. Prior to the revolution, the clergy was the single largest land and real estate owner of the kingdom, with maybe a third of everything, of all existing assets. This gives you an idea of the scale of this phenomenon. A lot of these asset sales were made at bargain prices because they had to be sold fast. The entire new elite of this new regime participated in this, from merchants to generals to lawyers to doctors to bankers. For a large part of the upper middle and upper class that supported the revolution, this was a huge opportunity, and in the 1790s there was a massive redistribution of assets and wealth in France, at the expense of the ancient orders, especially the church. This is important politically, because the new ruling class that had benefited so much from the revolution, from the abolition of all privileges to this huge redistribution of assets, would now support any regime that would guarantee the preservation of what they had gained. They wanted order, stability, and no return of the old aristocracy or of an absolute monarch. Years later, Bonaparte would become the best place to ensure exactly this, and they supported him as long as he could protect their interests. Obviously, Napoleon was never a democratically elected leader in the modern sense, but you cannot govern a country just on your own. Even dictators have popular support of some sort. They rely on certain parts of the society. Later in our story, he will rise to the head of France after a series of events that are crucial in themselves. But behind these events, he could reach power and stay there for years because he had won over a large part of the population, either through military glory and prestige, or through the promise of stability, order, and preservation of gains that he represented. But at this point, in 1796, Napoleon was still a long way from the imperial throne. There was not even a throne yet, because France was still a republic that had recently turned expansionist. General Bonaparte, as he was called at this point, led French armies throughout the north of Italy, and he won a number of battles against two main opponents, the kingdoms of Sardinia and Austria. This campaign was disastrous for the Austrians. They lost thousands of men, especially at the siege of Mantua, and Bonaparte entered the region of Tyrol, a mountainous region in the west of Austria. The road to the capital, Vienna, was now open, and nothing was left to stop his army. So the Austrian government sued for peace in 1797. At this point, the political situation had changed in Paris. The more radical faction of revolutionaries and its most prominent figure, Robespierre, had fallen, and their leaders had been executed. The period of terror was over, and a new organization had been put in place at the head of the Republic. A so-called directory of 5 directors. They controlled the country and its conquests, but at the head of the army, several generals had begun to follow a strategy of their own. This sounds weird nowadays, because in a modern country, any military commander that doesn't obey scrupulously the orders of the government or his superiors would be destituted and court-martialed. But the situation was different back then. In the chaos of the war and political instability, the army, and even various armies, had formed entities of their own that followed orders and a strategy, but at the heads of which generals had acquired a lot of autonomy. They were still expected to obey, but they used this leeway to promote themselves and sometimes treat directly with other powers without asking for permission. And this is exactly what Napoleon did in Italy. He made sure his victories were known and even embellished in Paris. Among other generals like Moreau, who was leading the northern offensive against Austria through Germany, he became famous as a victorious general during this campaign. And when he reached Austria, he overstepped his mandate and began negotiating the peace directly with the Austrian government. He did it because he thought, and he was right, that his new prestige as a victorious general after the brilliant campaign he had just achieved would protect him, and also because he wanted to outshine other generals and be the one who had obtained peace with the biggest enemy of France at the time on the continent. Arguably, this was reckless and quite revealing of the way he always tried to force destiny and advance his cause. I tell you about the man in a minute. Shielded by this fresh popularity and the political weakness of the Directory in Paris, he succeeded. The peace with Austria, through which France annexed Belgium, that was previously Austrian, is remembered as his achievement, even though he was just officially a general, not a diplomat or a politician. Together with other treaties, this peace with Austria put an end to this first coalition of countries against revolutionary France, and in 1797, after 5 years of conflict, peace was almost back. Almost, because no peace had been signed with Great Britain. War between France and Great Britain was in a standstill. On land, the British couldn't do much more than support other countries in their war effort, because their land army was too small and too stretched to start a frontal campaign on the continent. But all these continental powers like Spain, Prussia, Austria had made peace at this point. On the seas, the Royal Navy dominated and could prevent any invasion of Great Britain. There were skirmishes and small-scale operations in the colonies, mainly in America, but nothing that would convince either side of asking for peace. So the state of war continued. But soon, a new coalition, later called the Second Coalition, would rise against this new France that not only threatened its neighbors because of its anti-royalist nature, it also threatened to invade them and take their land with its expansionist policies. Before we talk about this second coalition and the rise to power of Napoleon that culminated in the proclamation of an empire, let's take a look at the character himself. The problem with that kind of great men in history is the weight of their legend. They become symbols of a period, and they probably receive more praise and more attacks than they deserve, especially when they lived in the past 2 or 3 centuries and their lives are well documented. Early on, even before he became an emperor, Napoleon worked very actively on the promotion of a personal legend, and his opponents or enemies also elaborated a black legend that systematically paints him as a villain. Parts of it have passed to popular culture. For example, there is this widespread belief that he was short and that somehow his ambition and thirst for power were a way to compensate. That's not the case. He was of average size, and his contemporaries had nothing to say about how tall he was. It seems this legend started with caricatures that made fun of him. I read that Napoleon is the one historical character that had the most books written about him. He's been scrutinized from every angle. there are a few traits that emerge from his personality. One thing that cannot be denied is his military genius. He had what looked like an innate capacity to imagine tactics and apply them to a battlefield. He won so many battles that he acquired a reputation for invincibility. That was not entirely true. He had setbacks too, but his track record as a general was indeed extraordinary. Apart from the military aspect, he was obviously very smart and quick to think and take decisions. It is not a personality trait, but another thing that followed him for the best part of his life was luck. He forced it more often than not, but plenty of elements that were independent from his will helped him. He often ended up being in the right place at the right time. A rival would die in combat just when he could have stopped or slowed him in his rise. He even had luck with the weather or enemies' mistakes that helped him. Maybe all this luck, the accumulation of successes, and his practical intelligence obscured his judgment because he could also be very overconfident. He made huge mistakes, the biggest one being the decision to embark on the campaign of Russia that we will talk about later. But the capacity to win battles and organize armies made him very good at winning wars. On a more strategic level, he was not as competent. He didn't win the peace. He humiliated the vanquished, sometimes uselessly so. He took them so much that the seeds of the next war, of the next coalition, were always in every peace treaty he ever signed. On a more personal level, he was incredibly ambitious. You have to be to achieve such a rise, and also quite cynical. The cynicism appears in his correspondence and countless testimonies. He didn't seem to have many moral values. These were utilitarian things to him. He would praise and celebrate patriotism to mobilize the crowds, but personally he didn't feel that French for the best part of his rise to power. He was born in Corsica, in a family of the local nobility. They descended from minor Italian nobility. They had this element of status, the aristocracy, in their favor, but the family was financially modest. They were respected locally, but on the continent he was a nobody. Corsica had been bought by France a few years prior to the revolution from the Republic of Genoa, and Genoa had sold Corsica to essentially get rid of it, because the island was fiercely independent and hard to control. This attitude didn't change with the annexation of the island by the Kingdom of France. People in Corsica didn't see themselves as French at all, and they were culturally closer to Italy. French was a second language for Bonaparte, and when he was sent to the continent, to France as a child, to study at a military school, he was an outsider there. His attachment to France began when he really saw how much personal gain he could get by serving this country, and later maybe be served by it. The cynicism extended to religion, which to him was mainly a political factor to be used or dealt with, that he considered advantageous to keep the population in its place. He also liked personal wealth. He never forgot it all along his career, even when he had proclaimed himself emperor. And there was some vanity in him. He enjoyed being admired, even adulated. And yet, which is another layer of complexity to this character, he was not a shallow man. He had a solid classical culture. He was from a generation that was obsessed with ancient Rome specifically. They had an in-depth knowledge of everything that could be known about it. In the regime he created, the influence of this passion for Roman antiquity can be found on many levels. The aesthetic, if you look at the architecture and the neoclassical works of art he commissioned or patronized, the political references. In his next step towards supreme power, he contributed to end the Directory at the head of the Republic, this system we talked about before with 5 directors. And it was replaced with something called the Consulate, with 3 consuls. This was a direct reference to the triumvirate of the 1st century BC in the Roman Republic, and the terminology itself, consul, comes from Rome. The shadow of ancient Rome is also in the attention paid to law and the administration of an empire. One of the legacies of the Napoleonic period is the Code Civil, the civil code, which has been amended regularly in the past 2 centuries, but is still in use in France and many other countries that adopted it. So as you see, I think all of this calls for a nuanced portrait of Napoleon. On many accounts, he was a man of his time, just with a level of ambition and a military genius that stood out, that were out of the ordinary. And he had also less respectable or impressive aspects to his personality. Thanks to his social class, the nobility, and the limited financial means of the family, he was sent to study in France. And when the French Revolution erupted in 1789, he was already an artillery officer. He quickly raised through the ranks, thanks to his merits for a part, and also thanks to the intense lobbying he always made with his superiors to advance his career. Opportunities to rise in the army didn't lack, and at only 24, he became a general. In 1795, there was a short insurgency by royalists in Paris, and luckily for him, he was in Paris at the time, available to repress the insurgents, which he did successfully. As a reward for his loyalty to the government and contributions to the Republic, he was given command of the army of Italy during the War of the First Coalition, and as we have seen earlier, he could triumph against the Austrians and their Italian allies. When this campaign of Italy began, he was only 26, and thanks to the series of battles he won, plus the peace he took the initiative to negotiate with Austria, and also all the publicity for his exploits that he orchestrated, to the point of creating a newspaper, a gazette, to inform the public of his triumphs that were obviously embellished on several occasions. All of this made him famous in France, and in 2 years he had turned himself into a war hero, a sensation. So we are now in 1798. Napoleon had returned victorious from Italy, and his star was shining bright. But he was not alone. Other generals, like Moreau, had also covered themselves in glory. At the time there was a general perception that the current regime of the Directory, this group of 5 directors at the head of the government, that had succeeded the more radical period of the Terror, was quite fragile, and that its days were probably numbered. Politically, the Directory was at odds with the previous period. It was a regime made by and for this new elite that had benefited the most from the first years of the revolution, the bourgeois and well-to-do segments of the population. And its priorities were to sort out the war situation, the budgetary, financial problems, which were still acute despite all the military victories, and above all, protect the gains of the revolution, especially the sale of national assets, which meant avoiding at all costs a return to the ancient order. The Directory was unpopular, especially with the more modest working class. In the previous phase, that we could call more leftist of the revolution, a number of measures had been taken to alleviate the deep economic trouble, actually the misery of the poorest, such as freezing the prices of grain and bread to stop the activity of speculators that had been thriving in the first years of the revolution. As a representative of the bourgeoisie, bankers and merchants, business and asset owners, the Directory abolished all this to reinstate the kind of laissez-faire economy that prevailed before. But it didn't make it popular with large parts of the population. And even the wealthy were not all satisfied, because to sort out the public debt problem, the Directory declared a bankruptcy. It defaulted on 2/3 of the debt, inflicting huge losses on the creditors. It worked quite well. This bankruptcy in 1797 is the last time the French state has defaulted on its debt. But the bottom line is that the Directory was liked by almost no one and despised by many. All informed people in Paris knew that one way or another it would fall. Even the directors knew it, and ultimately some of them were involved in the coup that would later put an end to their own government and propel Napoleon to the top of the state. But not yet. Before that, Napoleon led an expedition that remains among the most famous episodes of his adventures, the campaign of Egypt. Why did revolutionary France send an expedition to Egypt in 1798? It looked like a good idea at the time, but the reasons invoked for this expedition were rather dubious. One was that the last country still at war with France, Great Britain, derived a good part of its means, of its wealth, from its trade with India and East Asia. Invading Egypt would be a way to cut the road to India, or create a faster one. This was true in the sense that trade between India and Britain was already intense, especially in fabrics and cotton that fed the nascent British industry. except it didn't really work as a reason for invading Egypt, because at the time there was no Suez Canal. It was dug decades later, so all trade between India and Britain traveled south of Africa and in the Atlantic Ocean. There was no plan to push this invasion as far as India by land, which would have been unrealistic because of the distance. Another reason that made more sense was scientific. The passion for the antiquity was not receding, and ancient Egypt was an unknown world, an unknown continent to the Europeans, and a fascinating one, more ancient and mysterious than Rome and Greece. Scholars participated in the expedition, and they laid the foundations of Western Egyptology in those years, which was the main legacy of this expedition. Then there were less official reasons, but as often they were the main ones. War with Great Britain was in a standstill, and the government was looking for something to do. They couldn't come up with another better front line to open, and this weighed in the choice of Egypt. The campaign was also supported by allies and enemies of Napoleon alike. Everyone was aware that several generals could take the initiative or be the instrument of a coup d'etat. Bonaparte was one of them. He was too popular to get rid of him, but sending him away on a dangerous expedition would guarantee that he would not intend to coup, at least in the short term, and with luck he could even die there, which would have been even better. But Napoleon and his supporters were not against the idea either, because they thought the situation was not mature enough for a coup yet in 1798. In the meantime, Bonaparte could not just wait and see in Paris and see his Italian and Austrian glory slowly fade. He needed action. Replicating in Egypt his triumph in Italy could only do him good, and the risk of military failure was limited, because this time the opponents would not be the modern Austrian soldiers, but local fighters, the Mamluks. The Mamluks formed a militia that unofficially controlled Egypt at the time. The country was supposed to be a province of the Ottoman Empire, but in practice the Ottomans were in a state of weakness at this point, and they barely controlled provinces that were far away from Turkey and the Balkans. So, for reasons that had more to do with internal politics than military strategy, the choice of this expedition was made, and many risks were overlooked. Risks such as having to face the more powerful British Royal Navy in the Mediterranean Sea, or infuriating the Ottomans. For centuries, France and the Ottomans had been informal allies, because they had similar interests, especially against Austria. They had never been at war, and even though the Ottoman Empire was now only the shadow of what it used to be, losing this connection was a big cost. In 1798, 40,000 men sailed to Egypt on the French Mediterranean fleet, and at first it all went well. They could reach Egypt without being intercepted by the British fleet, which was commanded by Admiral Nelson. The British knew about this expedition. It was too big to hide, but they couldn't locate the French ships. However, after Napoleon's army had disembarked, they could spot the fleet unprepared along the coast of Egypt at a place called Aboukir and destroy it. This meant that the road back to France for this army was now cut, and an entire fleet had been lost for nothing at this point. But on land, Napoleon delivered, as he usually did. The main battle against the Mamluks took place near Cairo, the Battle of the Pyramids, and the French expeditionary forces obliterated the Mamluk army. Mamluk cavalry was no match for soldiers with much better guns, high discipline, and very experimented after their European campaigns. This battle is called the Battle of the Pyramids, and immediately Napoleon made sure it would be told and spinned as it should be to keep building his legend. There were other minor fights, but overall the army quickly took control of Egypt. Mission accomplished, except it had not accomplished much against the British. The Ottomans were now also at war with France, and the army was beginning to suffer from attrition because of diseases and a climate it was not used to or equipped for. Out of better options, Napoleon moved to the Levant, beginning to invade the Middle East. But on his way were Ottoman fortresses that resisted much more and caused heavy losses. He had to retreat, and he understood that the expedition that was supposed to comfort his image of war hero was in fact close to turning into a disaster, a drag on his reputation. The entire army could no longer be brought back to France. The fleet was gone, so he abandoned the men there and returned alone to Paris. The journey on the Mediterranean Sea was a big risk, but doing nothing was worse for him. So he took it, and as usual, he was lucky. He could return to France and somehow sell the expedition as a success. Egypt was now under control of the army he had left there. He had been victorious, and now ready to take on other missions for the glory of the Republic. In reality, the army that he left there slowly disbanded, and Egypt was lost in the following years. But the political situation had moved on, and he was never held accountable for the ultimate failure or uselessness of this campaign. Actually, for him, it was a success since the expedition had been a springboard to political power. I told you before that the fragility of the directory system and the high probability of a coup was an open secret in Paris. So much that instead of just putting up with events, politicians in and around the directory were willing to organize it themselves. They chose Bonaparte as the general who would participate in the coup because they needed one, in order to take control of the institutions, of the elected assembly, and suppress any reaction to the coup. They needed troops, and troops obeyed to their generals, especially when they had the glorious aura that came with victories. The plotters had prepared everything for a peaceful operation. One of them was Napoleon's own brother, Lucien Bonaparte. In parallel to his brother's military career, he had made a successful political career and was president of one of the two houses of the legislature, like the House of Representatives and the Senate in the US, or the House of Commons and the House of Lords in the UK. There were two houses, a lower house with the final say. It was called the Council of 500, and an upper house, the Council of the Ancients. The day of the coup was full of twists and turns, and sometimes it even bordered on comedy. And this is why I'm going to tell you a bit more about the coup itself. Lucien Bonaparte was president of the lower house, and the plan he engineered was to persuade both councils falsely that a left-wing coup was happening in Paris. Both houses would be persuaded to be escorted outside Paris to a suburban chateau under protection from troops, obviously commanded by Napoleon Bonaparte. At the same time, 3 of the 5 directors would resign. 2 of them were part of the coup, and they bought the resignation of a third one. The resignation of 60% of the directory, 3 out of 5, would trigger its dissolution, and the 2 assemblies, intimidated by the troops outside Paris, would be persuaded to appoint a commission that would draw up a new constitution, obviously tailored to the plotters' specifications. The plan was a bit complicated, but its advantage was to preserve appearances by making the 2 councils vote so that the whole process would appear somewhat legal. But things didn't go as planned at all, and the day of the coup followed a bizarre turn of events from which Bonaparte exited as the new strongman of the country, which was not anticipated at all. The directors resigned, as expected, but the 2 councils quickly understood that they were facing a coup, orchestrated from within the directory and even within their own assemblies. They began conversing and refused to follow the instructions of the plotters. As things didn't turn out as expected, and he was growing impatient, Bonaparte entered one of the 2 assemblies with a small group of soldiers, changing the nature of the coup that now became a military thing. He had to retreat, faced with the furious reaction of the council's members, and he went to the other council, which was gathering in another room, where he tried to take the stage and convince them. But under pressure, given the huge stakes and the hundreds of members of the parliament he had to face, he completely lost it and started an incoherent speech that infuriated people even more. What exactly followed is a bit unclear. He may have been physically assaulted, or he injured himself, but in any case the soldiers heard screams, and some of them came to his rescue, allowing him to escape. Then a motion was raised in the Council of 500 to outlaw this general, who was violating the 2 houses of parliament, and this put Napoleon into a very precarious position. If this motion had passed, and the councils had remained in control, he would have been outlawed and probably executed, ending everything abruptly. but his brother Lucien saved him. He exited the Council of 500, and he told the troops that a minority of deputies were terrorizing the council, which was an outright lie, but one that worked. The troops stormed the room and they expelled the council. The other council, the ancients, was also taken control of militarily and had to pass a decree that appointed 3 men to the head of the government, 3 consuls instead of directors previously. 3 plotters, actually, including Napoleon himself, who had come around and now appeared as the new strongman. Out of this chaotic day, which bordered on comedy, as I said, Napoleon had more or less intentionally made a coup within the coup. And with his control of the army in Paris, he would make sure in the following month that his position of power was set, if not in stone, at least in the law. With a new constitution that was hastily redacted, he became first consul, which gave him preeminence over the other 2. In a few weeks, he had become the most powerful man in France. He would soon find the appetite for even higher functions and titles. He would not share his power for long. And with the control of France, he also took control of the formidable war machine that came with it, an experimented, well-equipped army that he would develop much further and use to accomplish ever-increasing dreams of domination. Dreams that would quickly no longer be the dreams of a country looking for its way after it had dismantled the ancient order, but the dreams of a single man, threatened by hubris. General Bonaparte had just seized power in a coup of which he was just supposed to be a part of, a member of the group of plotters. But the turn of events and his control over the troops involved in the coup gave him preeminence. So he hastily drafted a new constitution in a few weeks that was submitted to a referendum at the beginning of 1800, adopted, and this created a system called the consulate, in which a council of 3 consuls was at the head of the government. But Bonaparte was first consul, and the 2 others had very limited powers. In practice, the first consul held all actual power, and this system was just another name for a dictatorship. Officially, France remained a republic, but in reality the phase of democracy, however imperfect it had been, was now over. Some of the appearances would be preserved, like calling referendums or having elected assemblies, but only with a consultative role. So as you see, in just 10 years, the French Revolution had very different regimes. There were like several revolutions within the revolution. It became a constitutional monarchy at the beginning, then a radical republic that granted universal suffrage for the first time. Everybody could vote, at least men. Then the Directory that I told you about in the first part, that was a kind of oligarchic republic. And finally an autocratic republic. In these last regimes, the universal right to vote was withdrawn, and vote became selective. Only people paying taxes, implying that they had an estate and high income, were granted the right to vote. Obviously, this sounds shocking and anti-democratic nowadays, but the logic was that the right to vote should be limited to responsible citizens who contributed to the functioning of the state through their taxes. The others could still enjoy almost the same rights: economic freedom, freedom of movement or of conscience, but not the right to choose the government. Of course, such a system could only elect conservative governments that cared for order, stability, and the protection of private property, which was exactly the intention of their creators. But actually, the principle of one man equals one vote was still seen as almost utopian and certainly very dangerous for stability in the late 18th century. Even nations that had advanced towards democracy, like the United States or the United Kingdom, did not apply it. There were property or wealth requirements to vote, or slavery existed which denied that right to some. And it is only progressively along the 19th and 20th centuries that the right to vote was extended to all male citizens, regardless of their wealth, and later to women. The first experience ever of universal suffrage in a large country was this short period starting in 1793, the First French Republic, and that didn't last long, but that was extremely radical at the time. So by taking power with this new constitution, did Napoleon put an end to the French Revolution? Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that he ended the attempts at democracy and he was a dictator. So he made the regime drift back towards autocracy, like before the revolution. But his new regime also acknowledged and protected many of the changes that had occurred in the 1790s and that would later spread to the rest of the Western world, like the elimination of birthrights, the elimination of all guilds and regulation that limited the access to certain professions or occupations to certain people, the protection of private property from interference by the state, freedom of conscience too. Many of these aspects were already present in the United States at the time, but the USA in 1800 were quite far from Europe, and they were still a fairly small country. They had 5 to 6 million inhabitants. For comparison, that was the population of Ireland at the time. France had 30 million inhabitants, and it was the second most populated country in Europe, just after Russia, with 35 to 40 million. This large population would be one of the bases of Napoleon's might that would be deployed in the following decade. Russia was also a country with a large population, and it would turn out to be a dangerous foe. But at the time, Russia was still lagging Western Europe in terms of technology and equipment, and its population was scattered on a very large area. The main neighbors of France, the participants in the First Coalition, were lagging demographically and couldn't field armies that big. Austria had a bit more than 20 million subjects, Prussia, Spain, or Great Britain, the island, not the entire United Kingdom, had about 10 million, and Napoleon's grip on France remained very firm, at least for the first 12 years of his reign as First Consul and later as Emperor. I'll tell you about that in a few minutes. He was very popular for most of this time. There was a period of hesitation in the month following his coup, but rather quickly he strengthened his grip on power and became well accepted. In the referendum of 1800 to vote on the new constitution and make him first consul, there were 3 million electors. Not much in a country of 30 million, but women could not vote, and remember that the electorate was selected based on wealth. He won by officially 99.9%. These results look a bit too good to be true, and indeed the participation numbers and rate of approval were rigged to make them look better. But he still was supported by the vast majority of asset owners in the country, big and small, for the stability and preservation of their rights that he embodied. But his popularity went far beyond the rich. In cities or in the countryside, he benefited from his prestige as a victorious general. He was a guarantee of peace, internally and externally, after 10 exhausting years. At least this is how he sold himself, because the following years were obviously not peaceful at all. And he also had an intuition that served him well politically. The rise of nationalism or patriotism. This sense of belonging to a nation, a community with a common history and a common destiny. This was not entirely new. It had been growing slowly along the 18th century. People developed a sense of belonging to their countries as opposed to just being the subjects of the same sovereign. In the American Revolution, 20 years earlier, the idea of nation was clearly present, and from the start the French Revolution referred to it. But that was still a very fresh concept, and one that had been reinforced along the first 10 years of the French Revolution, because the country had been able to overcome the adversity of falling into a civil war and being invaded at the same time, even becoming victorious and expanding in the process. Napoleon found a great tool in this, to position himself as the champion of a nation, its guide and its protector. This is a bit ironic, given that he had become French by accident, being born in Corsica, and his sense of patriotism was non-existent until it became advantageous for him to become a patriot. I told you about aspects of his personality and opportunism in the first part, but that was also a brilliant political intuition and one of his legacies. Political leaders and heads of state turned increasingly into national champions along the 19th century, for better or worse. This grip on the country he immediately needed, because just a few months after the end of the First Coalition, that had seen all European countries except Great Britain sign peace, war had already resumed, and a second coalition had appeared. The main participants to the first coalition against revolutionary France had been Great Britain, Austria, Prussia, Spain, kingdoms in Italy, and the Dutch Republic. It had ended with France annexing the Austrian Netherlands, that is to say, modern Belgium, and creating satellite states in the north of Italy and the Netherlands. But these peace treaties were more like ceasefires. They had not sorted out conflicts. The Austrians had been imposed very harsh peace conditions that they didn't intend to comply with. The Ottomans had been attacked too, attacked by France in the campaign of Egypt. And on the other side of Europe, another kingdom, Russia, was increasingly preoccupied of French expansionism and of the risk to traditional regimes and societies that this revolution had created. All these countries entered in mutual alliances against France and its satellites, and against France's new ally, Spain, which had reverted its alliances and was now willing to fight alongside France for various reasons, including not having an enemy on its frontier that it could not defend against, but also because of its rivalry with Great Britain in America, and the need to preserve its colonies around the world, which at the time were larger than ever, including half of the Americas from the American West Coast to the very south of South America. In 1799, before Napoleon even became First Consul, hostilities had already resumed, and this time the main opponents of France were Austria, Great Britain, Russia, the Kingdom of Naples in the south of Italy, Portugal, and the Ottoman Empire. The Allies began attacks on two main fronts, in Italy and Switzerland, and in the Netherlands. These attacks had mixed results. In the Netherlands, there was an Anglo-Russian force that was repelled and had to retreat. In Switzerland, it was worse. A Russian army started with initial victories, but then the army was completely routed at a battle near Zurich. In Italy, the Allies were more successful. The French were repelled to the Alps, the traditional frontier between France and Italy. But Russia quickly grew irritated with its allies. Its leader, Paul I, the Tsar, was faced with strong internal opposition, and indeed he would be killed or dethroned in 1801. So after a few months, Russia left the coalition and stayed out of the war for several years. That was the first setback for this second coalition, and things only went downhill from there. Napoleon, who was now in power in 1800, sent one of his best generals, Moreau, to campaign in Germany against Austria and its German allies. And at the same time he raised another army for himself that would march on Italy. The French counterattack won on all fronts. In Germany, Moreau invaded Bavaria and won a major battle, the Battle of Hohenlinden. Napoleon marched through Switzerland and he attacked the Austrians in the north of Italy. He defeated them, but narrowly, at the Battle of Marengo. For propaganda purposes, the story of this battle was rewritten to strengthen Napoleon's power. It was only 7 months after his coup, so the battle was spinned as a brilliant victory, and it was a success indeed, but not the kind of triumph that would be sold to the public. By 1801, the Second Coalition collapsed. Austria had been defeated again, Russia was gone, Prussia was not willing to enter a conflict on the side of a coalition that was now falling apart, and Spain and France had invaded Portugal. So once again, only the United Kingdom remained at war. But it had been at war with France for almost 10 years. The public opinion was turning against this permanent state of war. It was very expensive, and public debt was quickly mounting. Trade was disrupted, and the pro-war Prime Minister, William Pitt the Younger, fell to his political opponents. All of this decided the British to sign a peace in 1802, the Treaty of Amiens, a city in the north of France. So for the first time in 10 years, peace was back, but it wouldn't last. Napoleon's campaigns on the continent had remained victorious, but there were setbacks overseas. We saw in part 1 how the campaign of Egypt ended in failure, militarily and politically. In 1801, Napoleon sent another expedition, led by his brother-in-law, this time to the Caribbean, to the island of Saint-Domingue. Why? Along the 18th century, the most lucrative colonies for European countries were located in the Caribbean. They produced colonial goods like sugar, cotton, dyes or coffee. And for the Kingdom of France, the most developed and strategic of these colonies were the island of Martinique and the colony of Saint-Domingue on an island, Hispaniola, that was shared with Spain. The western part, which nowadays corresponds to Haiti, was French, and the eastern part, present-day Dominican Republic, was Spanish. After the beginning of the Revolution, upheavals took place in the colony, especially a massive slave revolt that led to the abolition of slavery in 1793 in Saint-Domingue, a decision that the National Assembly in Paris endorsed and spread to all its colonies. In fact, it was never really applied, and the decision was later reversed. Real abolition would wait several more decades. But there were many more black slaves than European-born colonists or their descendants in Saint-Domingue, and the slave revolt forced the central power in Paris to recognize their leader, a former slave called Toussaint Louverture, as the governor of the colony. Louverture fought off attempts to capture the colony by the Spanish in the eastern part and the British who tried landings. But after several years of autonomy in a colony where former slaves were now free, Louverture began to strain ties with France. He sent expeditions to the Spanish side, even though peace had been signed with Spain. And in 1801, he promulgated a constitution that made the colony self-ruled, and he declared himself governor for life. For the second time, after the 13 colonies that formed the United States, an European colony declared its independence in the Americas. These events happened during the wars of the First and the Second Coalitions, during which France couldn't really divert its attention from Europe. But by the end of 1801, things had changed. the Second Coalition was falling apart. Peace negotiations with the UK were underway, and the colonial lobby that represented wealthy plantation owners was trying to obtain help from the government to retake Saint-Domingue or be compensated. Almost all European colonists had left the colony at this point and relocated elsewhere in the Caribbean or in Louisiana, especially around New Orleans. Some of them recreated plantations there on the same model. In the 1790s, the relationship between Toussaint Louverture and Paris was relatively cordial. He even sent his two sons to be educated in Paris. But when he proclaimed independence and declared himself governor for life of the ex-colony in 1801, Napoleon decided to act and send an expedition to retake the colony, re-establish French rule, and compensate the planters. The colony was retaken with an expeditionary force in a very deadly campaign, but even though Toussaint was arrested and his supporters disarmed, the colony proved uncontrollable. Tropical diseases like yellow fever ravaged the army. Defections multiplied, and a new uprising in 1802 overwhelmed what remained of the French Expeditionary Corps. In 1804, after a reconquest, the former colony was proclaimed to be the second independent state in the Americas after the United States, under the name of Haiti. But Haiti would not be so successful. Just 2 years after its creation, the new state was plunged into a civil war, and it kept struggling for decades to restore its economy and pacify itself. The abandonment of Saint-Domingue, which was the most prosperous French colony of the 18th century, meant that Napoleon lost interest in colonial matters in America, and it contributed to the decision to sell Louisiana to the United States in 1803. When this happened, this sale of Louisiana was a big deal. It instantly doubled the size of the United States. The price paid was relatively modest, $15 million. Obviously it was worth much more than $15 million of today. It reflected the absence of developed cities, except New Orleans, and the lack of interest of Napoleon for a territory that could not be well defended, and that the United States would have probably taken one way or the other at some point. But in Europe, things looked much better for Napoleon. His popularity soared after victory against the Second Coalition and the Treaty of Amiens with the UK. He had delivered on his promise to bring back peace in advantageous terms. And because he never forgot to turn favorable circumstances into new advantages, he asked to become consul for life instead of having a limitation of 10 years to his mandate. The electorate was happy to oblige, and this was approved in a new referendum, another step towards autocratic power. But that was still not enough, and for some time another project had developed in Napoleon's head. Change regime again, and turn the consulate into an imperial system based on the Roman model. like power in the ancient Roman Republic, had turned increasingly personalized, leading to its replacement with an empire ruled by hereditary sovereigns. He would do the same with France, that had expanded its frontiers and was now surrounded by several client states. The circumstances were favorable. His popularity was at its highest point ever, and there had been several assassination attempts against him by royalists or left-wing Democrats, all uncovered and stopped by his police. Apart from attracting sympathy on him, these plots could justify the creation of a new dynastic system in which rulers have heirs that can immediately replace them and guarantee the continuity of the state and of the regime. So in 1804, a new referendum was held and massively approved the transformation of the French Republic, or what remained of this facade, into the French Empire, with Emperor Napoleon I at its head. In practice, this new regime continued the kind of dictatorship that the consulate had put in place, and beyond the revamp of titles and institutions, its bases were the same: preserve a strong government that guaranteed order, a number of civil liberties, economic freedom and property. The old aristocracy and the Catholic Church, whose properties had been confiscated and sold to the new elite, had to be barred from returning to claim what they had lost. The transformation of the social and economic system had been very fast and radical in France, but it was just an advanced signal of a broader phenomenon that took place all across Europe in the 19th century, and of which the US independence is also an aspect. The shift in power from the old aristocracy or religious authorities to a new emerging class, the bourgeoisie, either through revolutions, revolts, or incremental transformations over time. The old characteristics of the aristocracy, with legal privileges based on birth, all of this disappeared across the West in a century, and the meaning of the term privilege changed from a set of legal advantages to economic or relation-based advantages that some people receive because of the environment in which they are born. Napoleon actually recreated a nobility. He named new nobles that were granted titles, but this imperial aristocracy was more honorific than anything. The titles came without land. They didn't give other rights. And actually within the French aristocracy, which has not disappeared today, even though they just own titles and have a tradition, sometimes an estate inherited from their family history, but apart from that they are citizens like anyone else. A distinction is still being made between nobles of the Ancien Régime, from the times of monarchy prior to the Revolution, and nobles of the Empire. To the most snobs of the former, imperial nobility is still a bit too recent and of dubious extraction to be considered their equals. Another symbolic thing that reflected how times had changed is that Napoleon didn't become Emperor of France, he was Emperor of the French, implying that he was on the throne by the will of the people and not due to a God-given right. obviously that's more semantics than anything concrete, because the people would never be asked again if it was still their will. But it shows how the political, social, symbolic order of things had shifted since the revolution. And Napoleon was going to need all the resources of his new empire, because a third coalition was already on the horizon in 1804. Peace with the United Kingdom didn't last. The peace treaty was signed in 1802, but in May 1803, the UK declared war again. Why? Because Napoleon was taking advantage of the peace to make more gains, and because on the other side, the British government considered it couldn't let him satisfy his apparently never-ending appetite. In Italy, you remember Napoleon had created sister republics in the north after his invasion during the War of the First Coalition. He annexed the region of Piedmont, one of the wealthiest regions of Italy. In Switzerland, he intervened to put in place a friendly regime. Switzerland had been overrun by French armies and renamed the Helvetic Republic, a centralized state based on the ideas of the French Revolution in 1798. But the country was unstable and had turned into a battlefield with French, Austrian, and Russian armies ravaging it in the War of the Second Coalition. Napoleon intervened to recreate a confederation, the Swiss Confederation, that was independent, but due to its proximity to France and Napoleon's influence, it had in fact fallen into the French sphere of influence. These actions did not violate the terms of peace with Great Britain, but they inflamed tensions as the government in London realized that by leaving Napoleon alone, they were enabling him to keep expanding. The Royal Navy was still far superior to the French fleet, but France was allied with Spain, and the British remembered that there had been times in the 17th and 18th centuries when the French fleet had been a threat, like at the time of the American War of Independence. Giving Napoleon the time to build the fleet, now that he also controlled the Netherlands, yet another maritime power. This was a huge risk. So the UK refused to apply some of the terms of the Treaty of Amiens, like the evacuation of Malta in the Mediterranean Sea, and instead it decided to return to war. They needed allies, and in 1803 and 04, their diplomacy worked on the creation of a third coalition that they offered to support financially. After the harsh peace conditions imposed on the vanquished, especially on Austria, and the ongoing expansionism of France, they found an interested audience across Europe. At the end of 1804, Sweden joined the UK, and in 1805, Russia, which had a new Tsar, Alexander I. Austria had reorganized after its defeat of 1801 and rejoined a few months later, taking its allies from Germany, from the Holy Roman Empire, into the conflict. The Holy Roman Empire that I have sometimes referred to was not a state, it was a loose confederation inherited from the Middle Ages, made of dozens of small states, kingdoms, principalities, duchies, free cities, that covered initially all of Germany, the Low Countries, and the north of Italy. It lost territory along the centuries and ended up being centered on Germany, but for a long time it had been under the influence, under the lead of the Habsburgs, the rulers of Austria and Hungary. The Habsburgs didn't have full control over the various states of the Holy Roman Empire, but it was one of the sources of their power and influence in Europe through their active diplomacy and their alliances with some of the states of the Holy Roman Empire. The War of the Third Coalition lasted 3 years, and it ended in disaster for some of its members, helping Napoleon to project his power far beyond the frontiers of France and begin to remodel Europe to his liking. For the first 18 months, it was only against the United Kingdom, and Napoleon organized the gathering of a large army, 200,000 men, near the city of Boulogne on the French coast, where the crossing to Great Britain could take only a few hours. But between his army and the other side of the Channel was the Royal Navy. Everyone was aware of this, and the plan that emerged was to try and attract a part of the Royal Navy away by sending, for example, an expedition to the Caribbean, and then a combined French and Spanish fleet would secure the Channel, even for a short period of time, for a quick crossing to England. And once in England, Napoleon had little doubt that he would be able to invade the entire island. On the British side, this possible invasion was a source of concern. Fortifications were built along the coast, and militias were raised. But the French had none of the ships necessary to carry these troops. The bulk of French naval forces, the ships of the line, were split into a fleet of the Atlantic in Brest, in Brittany, and a Mediterranean fleet in Toulon. Both ports were blockaded by superior forces. So Napoleon's plan, or hope, was that the Mediterranean fleet would be able to break the blockade nevertheless, then sail to the Caribbean, where it would form a single large fleet with Spanish ships. They would somehow lose the Royal Navy in the Atlantic on their return to Europe, join forces with the French Atlantic Fleet, and then force the Channel and secure it long enough for the army to cross to the other side. Napoleon successfully executed this kind of audacious moves with the element of surprise on land several times, but on the seas, with all the unforeseeable elements like the winds and the hypothetical ability to escape larger enemy fleets, this didn't look that realistic. And indeed, the plan was called off, not just because it was unconvincing, but also because the Third Coalition was gathering, and a new large land conflict in continental Europe was approaching, which the members of the coalition couldn't hide given the scale of their preparations. Shortly after the plan for the invasion of Great Britain had been postponed in 1805, on top of this, the Battle of Trafalgar happened, in which the main British fleet, commanded by Admiral Nelson, destroyed a large part of the Spanish and French fleet. The French Mediterranean fleet at Toulon was under blockade, but in the hope of attracting it outside the port and force a battle, Nelson maintained a loose blockade. He hoped that the French would try to move away from the protection of coastal artillery to attack the few visible ships, and then he would be able to engage his main force against them. But this plan backfired. The Toulon fleet sailed out for a journey to the port of Cadiz in the south of Spain, where it was supposed to join the Spanish and execute the plan by sailing to the Caribbean. Due to the loose blockade and bad luck, there were storms. Nelson couldn't intercept it, and the fleet escaped, reaching Cadiz in a few days. Then they sailed to the Caribbean. Nelson pursued it, and the battle took place against the joint fleets off the coast of Spain several weeks later, after the crossing of the Atlantic and the journey back to Europe. On paper, the two fleets were of similar size and similar firepower, but British ships were more modern, better commanded, and better coordinated. Nelson knew it, and he tried an audacious maneuver to cut the line of enemy ships, starting the battle very differently from the usual tactics employed in naval battles. This proved very efficient. Most of this combined Franco-Spanish fleet was sunk or captured, enough to guarantee naval supremacy to the Royal Navy for the foreseeable future. And actually, this supremacy would not be challenged again until the end of Napoleonic Wars. So the Battle of Trafalgar did not actually stop the plan to invade Great Britain, because it had already been called off, but it postponed it indefinitely, and it was still a major strategic success because it eliminated the risk of an invasion for several years at least. Trafalgar took place in October 1805, and it was a success for the coalition, but an isolated one, because on land, the invasion plans were once again turning into a disaster for the Allies. 2 months before Trafalgar, the troops stationed along the English Channel had been diverted to the east to attack through Germany, where the combined armies of Austria, Russia, German states, and possibly Sweden were expected to gather. Napoleon's army had been grown to 350,000 men at this point, by far the largest single army Europe had ever seen. Soon it would be called the Grande Armée, the Great Army. It had received a lot of training and state-of-the-art equipment, which contrasted with other large foreign armies that had to be mobilized hastily and were much less professional in the years 1805-1806. This army would form the backbone of Napoleon's campaigns and victories in the following years. And on land, the Third Coalition suffered a series of disasters. It started for the Austrians at the Battle of Ulm in southern Germany. 200,000 French soldiers had crossed the Rhine to march on Germany in various directions. The Austrians had concentrated their main army, 60,000 men, at the fortress of Ulm. Thanks to Napoleon's army rapid marching, Austrian troops were outflanked and encircled at Ulm, cutting off 60,000 men that had to surrender against only 2,000 French casualties. Even before the Russians had arrived, the Austrians had already lost the bulk of their forces, and continuing eastward, Napoleon reached and captured Vienna. What followed is probably his most famous battle, Austerlitz. Francis II, the ruler of Austria and Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, had been joined near Vienna by the Russian army and Alexander I, the new young Tsar. Napoleon needed another decisive battle to leave the two countries with no other option than sign peace at his conditions. But he couldn't force them to engage in battle. So he tricked them. As he was still near Vienna, he gave every indication that the French army was in a poor state. He ordered some of his forces to simulate a retreat north of Vienna, and he even abandoned the best defensive position in the area, a plateau called Pratzen Heights, near the village of Austerlitz. The two other emperors decided to engage him with a combined Austro-Russian army. Francis II, because he was desperate to retake his capital, and Alexander I, because he had not brought an army from so far to just sit and wait. So they advanced and took position on Pratzen Heights, which looked like a safe move since it was easy to defend and the French army was probably exhausted anyway, or so they thought. The battle took place in December. Napoleon presented an army that looked weak on its right flank. The obvious move for the Austro-Russians was therefore to attack on this side, so that they would be able to disband part of Napoleon's army and attack it from two sides. But this was a trap. Napoleon knew that reinforcement was coming from Vienna and would plug the gap just in time, preventing this segment of the battle line to collapse. And as the Allies were slowly deploying their attack, weakening the defenses of Pratzen Heights, he launched a massive assault on it, retaking the plateau and cutting the Allies in two parts. The Austrian and Russian line was collapsing, which in a battle of this era was a disaster for an army, because it exposed its logistics, its artillery, and its ability to maneuver and defend its flanks. The Allies began to disband chaotically, allowing the French to take thousands of prisoners and to destroy the main force of the Third Coalition. Austria sued for peace again and was presented with a peace treaty that confirmed the territorial losses of its previous treaties with France, adding only a financial indemnity. This was relatively generous in Napoleonic terms because neither Russia nor Great Britain had agreed to peace yet. The Third Coalition was gone since only two major countries remained at war with France in 1806, but more would join soon. And they would join because Napoleon's appetite still raged on. Following the knockout of Austria, he created another state in Germany, intended to serve as an ally and a buffer state between France and Central Europe, the Confederation of the Rhine, which was a collection of German states put together in the same confederation. This meant that the Holy Roman Empire had effectively ceased to exist after a millennium. There will be more of this, but this is an illustration of Napoleon's policy and difficulty to create the conditions of a lasting peace. If he ever wanted peace, he was at least clumsy because he systematically created conditions that were unacceptable for other powers. A line of defense of his propaganda and his supporters, including after his exile, was that he only defended France from attacks. And technically, it may look like it. There was peace in 1802, and hostilities resumed in 1803 with a British declaration of war, after which France received multiple declarations of war until the end. But this ignores the extremely harsh peace conditions imposed by Napoleon, or it fails to explain how a defensive war that starts near the Rhine River ends up in Moscow 8 years later, thousands of miles to the east. So, as in every war, there may be a debate about shared responsibilities, but it cannot ignore that Napoleon acted as a bully, as a threat, way more than the Allies. And this is also why, from this point on, after the Third Coalition, many historians considered that these wars were no longer a country defending itself or its regime. They had become the wars of a man using a country and other states he had taken control of to pursue his dreams of domination. In a context like this, it was not surprising that old enemies would reappear. For the moment, in 1806, it would be Prussia, which was worried that the Confederation of the Rhine, created by Napoleon, was a direct attack on its influence in Germany, which it was. With the re-entry of Prussia into the conflict, this phase is known as the Fourth Coalition, but in fact it is mainly the continuation of the Third Coalition. Other belligerents like Russia, Great Britain or Sweden had not signed peace. The Fourth Coalition, and especially Prussia, was completely crushed. A few weeks after declaring war, the Prussians lost all hopes at the battles of Jena and Auerstedt, two simultaneous battles that were deadly on both sides, but decisive victories for Napoleon. Berlin fell, and Prussia was imposed very harsh peace conditions. It lost half its territory to a new state created by Napoleon called Westphalia. The quick and absolute defeat of 1806 remained an open wound for Prussia along the 19th century, and a major motivation to modernize its armies, expand and unify Germany. And indeed, the Prussians would take their revenge. In 1806 they were at a low point when Napoleon entered Berlin. In 1871, 65 years later, they proclaimed the German Empire near Paris after their victory in the Franco-Prussian War. With Prussia out of the way, the main opponent on the continent was now Russia. Russia had participated shortly in the Second Coalition, but withdrawn quickly, and in the Third Coalition, it had just suffered a painful defeat at Austerlitz. But the country had large reserves of men. Its capital, St. Petersburg, and its largest city, Moscow, were not exposed to a quick invasion like Vienna or Berlin, and Tsar Alexander I was decided to stand against Napoleon. The French Emperor had now left Prussia to enter Poland, and once again withdraw frontiers. He created a Duchy of Warsaw, to be ruled by his latest ally, the King of Saxony in Germany. Saxony had dropped the Allies and switched sides, seeing the complete collapse of Austria. Napoleon once again wanted a decisive battle, and he got one opportunity at the Battle of Eylau in February 1807. But it ended in a draw, and the Russians could retreat orderly. The second chance would be the right one. In June 1807, he could engage the Russian army at Friedland, north of Poland. With 60,000 troops, he routed much of the Russian army of 84,000. Alexander I was now forced to enter peace negotiations with Napoleon. The Fourth Coalition was also ended, now that Russia was about to withdraw from the war. And of the meeting between the two emperors in 1807, a surprising reversal of alliances was going to emerge. The Russian army had been decimated by two main battles at Eylau, which was an indecisive battle but very deadly on both sides, and even more at Friedland, which was a decisive victory for Napoleon. This didn't leave much room for negotiation for Tsar Alexander, but on the other hand, Napoleon was willing to turn Russia into an ally and would be inclined to propose relatively lenient terms. He wanted an ally that could be on the other side of Europe and would help keep in check Austria and Prussia, and maybe even help discourage Great Britain by cutting its trade connections to the continent and depriving it of potential allies. So, despite the war that had just taken place, the two emperors started negotiating on a relatively friendly basis, and they could agree on an alliance. France would gain a major ally with a frontier with Austria, and one that would participate in Napoleon's new project of blockading the United Kingdom by preventing it from trading with the whole continent. Russia would be spared losses of territories and gain time to recreate its armies. There was also an anti-British lobby in Russia that was hostile to Britain because of its commercial pressure around Russian ports and its past support to the Ottoman Empire, an archenemy of Russia. An alliance with France could also leave Russia hands-free with the Ottomans and another old enemy allied to the UK, Sweden. But Russia never embraced this alliance completely, because it was clearly unbalanced. Napoleon had recreated a state in Poland, which Russia was strongly against. It was called the Duchy of Warsaw, and not Poland, but it was a clearly Polish state, and the mere existence of Poland was a problem for the Russians. There had been a time, 200 years earlier, when Poland-Lithuania had been a vital threat to Russia, the Duchy of Muscovy as it was called before it became Russia. This danger was long gone, but in the 18th century, Russia had participated with Austria and Prussia in the sharing of Poland. Each of them had annexed regions of Poland until the country disappeared completely. So seeing it recreated was in itself a setback, and a risk of seeing Polish populations living in Russia revolt to rejoin this new Polish state. Another problem for Russia with this alliance was that Napoleon did not intend to share anything. There would be a Franco-Russian axis to solve all conflicts in Europe, but the zone of influence for Russia would be limited to its own territory, whereas the rest of continental Europe would be essentially allies and satellites of France, including Russia's direct neighbors. So the main advantage of this alliance was to stop the conflict immediately on rather favorable terms, despite the situation of weakness. But longer term, there was not much to take for Russia in this deal. The deal was quite unattractive. So from the moment this peace treaty and alliance were sealed, they are called the Treaty of Tilsit, after the place where Napoleon and Alexander met. The Russians had second thoughts, and these doubts only grew in the following years, because Napoleon kept expanding in Europe, and the cost of the continental blockade penalized the Russian economy. The idea of imposing an embargo on British goods had emerged several years earlier, after the plans to invade Great Britain had been dropped. At the time, in 1804, the appearance of the Third Coalition meant that armies were needed to fight on the continent, and after the Royal Navy had strengthened its control of the seas following the Battle of Trafalgar, it became obvious that invading Great Britain would be, if not impossible, at least very difficult. Continental Europe as a whole was the main client for British manufactured and colonial goods. It accounted for 55% of British trade in 1802. And trade was crucial to Great Britain, not just for the profits it generated, but because Great Britain needed raw materials and increasingly food, because it was already in the early stages of changing from an agriculture-based to an industry-based economy. So that cutting all its trade connections could, in theory, lead to an economic collapse. For France and countries across the rest of continental Europe, sea trade was less crucial. They were self-sufficient for food. The British retaliated with a similar embargo that forbade ships from trading with France. Overall, this embargo, it is also called the Continental System, didn't work well. It only marginally reduced British trade. The British lost a lot of trade with Europe. Its share fell from 55 to 25% of their trade, but it didn't disappear completely, because smuggling grew exponentially, and some countries like Portugal, Spain and Russia never really accepted to apply it. Having got rid of French, Dutch and Spanish merchants, the British could compensate a large part of the decline in European trade in other parts of the world. So this embargo and the retaliation by the British didn't produce the intended results, but it had major consequences. It contributed to the opening of a new front in Spain and Portugal, an episode called the Peninsular War, and years later it was a factor behind the Anglo-American War of 1812 and the invasion of Russia by Napoleon too. We will talk about all this later. For the moment, let's take a look at the Peninsular War in Spain and Portugal. I told you in previous parts how Spain had switched alliances after the War of the First Coalition. it had sided with France in 1795. At its frontier was Portugal, the oldest ally of England and then the UK. The alliance dated back from the 14th century. For this reason, the French pushed the Spanish to invade Portugal during the War of the Second Coalition, and in 1801, Portugal was invaded by much larger forces, which it couldn't do much against. After this brief war, Portugal had to sign a treaty by which the country assumed duty to close its ports to British trade. It was, in fact, bullied by Spain and France into cutting its ties to Britain. Due to the risk of having much bigger enemies at its frontier, the Portuguese royal family fled to Brazil in the 1800s. But despite the treaty, the Portuguese kept secret diplomatic relations with London, and they didn't enforce the embargo with a lot of zeal. In 1804, when the Battle of Trafalgar took place, the Portuguese were quite happy to see the Franco-Spanish fleet beaten, and the Third Coalition was forming on the continent, with Austria and Russia returning to war. So the king grew bolder and officially resumed trade and diplomatic relations with Britain. Unfortunately for Portugal, Trafalgar turned out to be the only major victory of the coalition in this war, and the continental enemies of Napoleon were crushed, one after the other, between 1805 and 1807. So when the situation in Central Europe was under control in 1807, Napoleon ordered another invasion of Portugal to punish it and finally enforce the continental system. This invasion was the first step of a long-lasting war in the Iberian Peninsula, hence the name Peninsular War, that the French never managed to win because, contrary to the battlefields of Germany or Austria and Prussia, it turned into a war of guerrilla. In 1808, the year following the invasion of Portugal, it is Spain that revolted. Spain was still a traditional monarchy. It was even ruled by a branch of the Bourbon, the same dynasty that had lost the throne of France because of the revolution. Spain was an ally to France, and the last of its neighbors that had not been turned into a satellite. Apart from Spain, Belgium, the Austrian Netherlands, had been annexed. The Netherlands turned into a puppet state, so had been German neighbors in the Confederation of the Rhine, the Swiss Confederation, the north of Italy. Spain was the last neighbor with a degree of political autonomy, and Napoleon was working on reducing this independence. French agents in 1807-1808 became heavily involved in Spanish affairs. They incited discord between the various members of the royal family and the various political factions in the country. These conflicts already existed before, but they were given enough importance to justify a French military intervention, officially to mediate between rival factions, in reality to reshape the regime to Napoleon's liking. A large army of 120,000 French troops was sent into Spain, officially to support the country, and it occupied Madrid. The king had abdicated, and his heir requested Napoleon's approval to take the throne. Both were summoned to the frontier with France, and they were convinced to abdicate. They were left with no other choice. After which Napoleon imposed his own candidate to the throne of Spain, who happened to be his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, because there's nothing like family. When I told you in earlier parts of this story that Napoleon was unable to win peace because he took too much, this is a good example. And his inclination to place his siblings on European thrones didn't end with Spain. He also did it on the throne of Naples in the south of Italy, and the kingdom he recreated in Holland. But instead of the smooth transition that had been expected and should have seen Spain fall in the orbit of France, things never stabilized. The Spanish population revolted against this occupation. The revolt started in Madrid and gained other cities, large and small, across the country. Years of repression began against passive resistance and guerrilla operations. They were supported, obviously, as much as possible by the British. The Spanish government had accepted Napoleon's decision to grant the throne to his brother, but the population never did, and the insurgency gained Portugal. In 1808, tens of thousands more French troops had to be sent to retake control of Spain. They won most of their engagements with small revolted armies, but suddenly they suffered a surprising defeat in the south of Spain at the Battle of Bailen. This battle against the Spanish army in revolt was not a huge fight. There were 20,000 to 30,000 troops on each side, but it was the first open field defeat of a Napoleonic army ever. So in terms of image, it was a big blow to the reputation of invincibility on land that Napoleon's armies had established in the 1800s. It showed the force of national resistance, which ironically France had been the biggest proponent and heavily relying on in the 1790s, but that could now also play against France in occupied territories. The Battle of Bailen inspired resistance far beyond the frontiers of Spain, and it contributed to the creation of a fifth coalition, with Austria rejoining the conflict yet again. The British and the Portuguese landed armies and tried to coordinate an effort against the French. But at this point in 1808, Napoleon had his hands free. So he took command of a large army that crossed the Pyrenees, the mountains between France and Spain. And once again, he delivered a very efficient campaign in Spain that resulted in large revolted armies being eliminated and the British forced to evacuate. He then led tens of thousands of troops to occupy Spain in the hope that the rebels would be suppressed over time and that the population would end up accepting the new order. In 1809, a new coalition was rising against him and called for his presence in Central Europe. So he left Spain. But the country could never be pacified, and it remained a drain on the French army until a retreat by the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Portugal was retaken by British and Portuguese armies. It served as a base for raids, and the Peninsular War raged for years, making more victims in Spain than any other conflict in modern history for the country. So, despite Napoleon's campaign in Spain, The Spanish theater had inspired Austria to return to war in 1809. The re-entry of Austria into the conflict is called the War of the Fifth Coalition. But like with Prussia and the Fourth Coalition 3 years earlier, it was just a continuation of the state of war, with just one belligerent more. On the side of the Allies, there were Austria, plus Great Britain and Spain and Portugal in revolt. But this time, contrary to previous coalitions, the numbers were not on the Allied side. In front of them, Napoleon had his army of hundreds of thousands, and he still had satellite states to support him, the Confederation of the Rhine, the republics created in Italy, the Netherlands, and the Duchy of Warsaw, plus German states like Saxony and Bavaria, that had dropped their alliances with Prussia and Austria to join the side of France. From the start, the War of the Fifth Coalition didn't look good for the Allies, and indeed it ended in another disaster for Austria, and a costly one. So why did Austria join this war to begin with? The government was divided about it. Going to war with no other big ally looked like a reckless move. But on the other hand, there was the situation in Spain, showing that hope was possible because Napoleonic armies were not invincible. There was also the hope of bringing more allies once Austria would be at war. And the Austrian army had also been reformed to adapt to modern warfare after its quite poor showing in the wars of the past 20 years, the almost systematic defeats against the French. And also, a large army had been kept mobilized after the Third Coalition, and this was very expensive. Public finances were doomed to crash if this army was not used quickly or disbanded. The idea of disbanding was repulsive for Austria, taken between France and Russia, so the army would have to be used. For these reasons, Austria went to war again, and regretted it quickly, but not before proving that Napoleon was not invincible, and that his domination of battlefields could maybe be challenged one day. The Austrians began their attack in Bavaria, allied with France, and it is in this region of Germany and around the Danube River that the war was decided. The concentration of Austrian troops in this region meant that they often were on a par or more numerous than the French that still had to occupy Spain and also defend the Netherlands from a British expedition, which they did. For the first time in 10 years, Napoleon was beaten in a large battle. It happened at the Battle of Aspern-Essling. Napoleon tried to cross the Danube, but superior Austrian forces drove his army back. He was able to regroup, and the Austrians could not exploit their victory. But for Napoleon this was an embarrassing setback, and everything was made to hide it from the public in France or across Europe. But this little flame of hope for the Allies was short-lived. Napoleon concentrated more troops and guns before trying another crossing 6 weeks later. And this time, he could win a decisive battle at Wagram. Once again, Austria had lost the majority of its forces, and it had to ask for peace. And this time the peace would be particularly harsh. It was the 4th time in 15 years that Austria had to ask for peace. The first time it had mainly lost the Austrian Netherlands, that is to say, modern Belgium. The second time, after the Second Coalition, the peace treaty only reaffirmed the territorial terms of the first, and yet again after the Third Coalition. But after the end of the Fifth Coalition, Napoleon had come to the conclusion that Austria had to be punished and hit near its heartlands to avoid yet another attack. In October 1809, Austria signed the Treaty of Schönbrunn, the summer palace of the Habsburgs near Vienna, in which it lost 20% of its population. The Adriatic coast, near Italy, was taken by France. A region to the north, Galicia, went to the Poles. The area of Tyrol and Salzburg in Austria went to Bavaria, and even Russia got a little piece in western Ukraine. The Austrians also had to pay a hefty war indemnity, and the daughter of Emperor Francis of Austria, Marie-Louise, would be married to Napoleon. This would be Napoleon's second marriage. He was never a big romantic, but since he was a young man, he had had relationships. As a young officer in the first years of the Revolution, he was engaged to the daughter of a wealthy merchant from Marseille in the south of France. In 1795, he met his future wife, Joséphine, in Paris. She is generally called Joséphine de Beauharnais, after the name of her first husband, who was a noble executed during the years of the Terror. She may have narrowly escaped execution herself, because she was incarcerated when Robespierre fell at the end of the most radical phase of the Revolution, the Terror. Joséphine was French but born in the West Indies, in the island of Martinique, in a family of planters. The family used to be relatively wealthy, but they lost most of their estate to hurricanes before the Revolution, and she was sent to France to marry Alexandre de Beauharnais, a wealthy aristocrat. In the years of the Revolution, except when she was imprisoned because of her husband, she became a kind of socialite in revolutionary Paris. She was beautiful, funny, cultured too. For all her life she was a lover and patron of the arts. And she collected lovers, living a life of happy widow. When Napoleon met her, he fell for her charm, and maybe also for her connections to members of the government and high-ranking generals. At the time he was on the rise, but not yet famous nor covered in glory by the campaign of Italy. This would happen in the following years. She also liked him, and her interest only grew with Napoleon's rise. There was probably sincerity in their relationship. They exchanged love letters for years when they were separated. But to gossipers in Paris they were also a well-assorted couple of social climbers. Napoleon married her against the wishes of his family. They disliked her because she was older than him and for her reputation of having multiple lovers, which she didn't try to hide too much until Napoleon came close to supreme power. And also she made Napoleon's mother and sisters uncomfortable. They felt second class in her presence because she was sophisticated and witty, which they were not at all, arriving straight from Corsica to Paris. They at the same time despised her and felt belittled by her. But Napoleon didn't care, and he married Joséphine, which didn't stop either of them from entertaining side relationships. And in the wake of her husband, she became like a First Lady of France when he became First Consul, and then Empress of the French from 1804. But she couldn't have children, a big problem for an empress in a now hereditary system. And of course, her social background looked cheap for the wife of the new master of Europe. This meant that politically and diplomatically, this marriage was useless at this point, even though Napoleon himself also had relatively humble origins. So Napoleon divorced her to be able to marry Marie-Louise of Austria in 1810, in the hope that this would seal the alliance with Austria after the Fifth Coalition and give him a heir. He got a son in 1811, but the Austrians would never let this royal marriage get in the way of their return to war, so politically it didn't bear fruit. So this is how Josephine was disposed of and replaced with Marie-Louise. Josephine remained in good terms with Napoleon and died before him in 1814, aged 51. Marie-Louise was 19 when she got married to Napoleon. She survived him after his fall, and she became Duchess of Parma in Italy, and the actual ruler of the duchy until her death in 1847. So, after the victory of Napoleon against the Fifth Coalition, his empire reached its peak in 1810. More territories were annexed to France, the Netherlands, and parts of North Germany, up to Hamburg, parts of Italy too, previously Austrian provinces on the Adriatic, which had the effect of landlocking Austria, and on the top of this, Napoleon had several satellite states or allies, like the Confederation of the Rhine, the Kingdom of Spain, even though it was in a state of revolt, the Kingdom of Naples in the south of Italy. War went on with Great Britain and in Spain, where it took the shape of a fight against the insurgency. Russia made peace with Sweden, taking Finland from it, and this took Sweden out of the war against Napoleon. At the same time, there was a succession crisis in Sweden, and the parliament, the Riksdag, chose to offer the regency and succession to the throne to one of Napoleon's marshals, Bernadotte. He accepted with Napoleon's agreement and later became King of Sweden, starting a new dynasty that still is on the throne of Sweden nowadays. But 3 years later, in 1813, Bernadotte turned against Napoleon and took Sweden back into the war against his previous master, when he saw that the odds were turning against Napoleon. At the beginning of the years 1810, the Napoleonic Wars continued to have repercussions overseas, especially on the other side of the Atlantic. First, because of growing tensions between the United States and the United Kingdom that had started in the previous decade. First, because independently from European matters, there was a growing sense in the US that Great Britain was hindering the expansion of the United States. There was Canada to the north, but also Britain supplied arms to Native Americans, and these weapons served in raids and skirmishes on the American frontier. Also, from 1803, Great Britain enforced a naval blockade against trade with France, and pressed sailors to join the Royal Navy instead of working for merchants, including American sailors. All of this, plus the fact that most of the British army was in Europe, engaged in Spain or ready to intervene, so the timing looked good, this decided the United States to go to war in 1812. The war raged from 1812 to 1814 and ended without changes of frontiers. At the time peace was being negotiated and signed in 1815, the European situation had changed completely, and blockades were no longer an issue. Further to the south, the consequences of Napoleonic Wars left bigger marks with revolutions multiplying in Latin America. These movements of independence would have probably happened sooner or later, because Spain and Portugal had declined so much that they couldn't keep controlling their very large empires. But the turmoil in Europe and the Peninsular War accelerated them. Independencies happened sometimes peacefully, like in Brazil. The Portuguese royal family had escaped to Brazil and established their capital there. After the defeat of Napoleon, they returned to Portugal. But the heir stayed in Brazil and declared independence. This helped keep Portuguese America intact instead of fractioning into multiple countries like Spanish America did. In Spanish colonies, the occupation of Spain and the abdication of the Bourbon let them organize multiple governments by local elites. In the 1810s, these autonomous governments took their independence, and wars ensued between revolutionaries and royalists who remained loyal to the Spanish crown. Eventually, the entire mainland took its independence and formed new countries from Mexico to the north to Argentina and Chile to the south. Spain was left mainly with islands in the Caribbean, especially Cuba, and the Philippines on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. From 1810 to 1812, Napoleon's grip on continental Europe remained firm. Prussia and Austria had been diminished, and only the Peninsular War in Spain saw fighting for the French army. But in the east, with Russia, the situation was fastly deteriorating. You remember I told you earlier that Russia was uncomfortable from the start in its alliance with France, especially because of Poland. Each side wanted a semi-independent Poland it could control. Poland, the Duchy of Warsaw, was clearly in Napoleon's orbit, and the Russians had a hard time tolerating it. On top of this, Russia didn't want to support the continental system and enforce the blockade, so Russia did not demobilize and kept its options open. Its reluctance to comply with Napoleon's orders and the understanding that sooner or later Russia would turn against him are the reasons why Napoleon decided to take the initiative, as he usually did. In the spring of 1812, at the height of his power, he declared war on Russia and began an invasion of his new enemy. Napoleon had never lost a campaign in Europe, and his army was bigger and more powerful than ever. Almost 500,000 men crossed the frontier. The Grande Armée had recruited for years, and with Napoleon's allies it was now a multinational force. 200,000 Frenchmen participated in the invasion of Russia, about 40% of the invasion force. The rest came from Germany, Poland, Italy, or the Balkans, but every European nationality was represented. At first, all went well. The army advanced unchallenged. It won minor engagements, but it soon appeared that the Russians were preserving the bulk of their forces. Napoleon commanded the center of the army. His left was faced with a high concentration of Russian forces, so instead of marching on St. Petersburg, the Russian capital, he advanced towards the historical capital and main city of Russia, Moscow, calculating that the Russians would have to go into battle to protect it, and they would be forced to negotiate peace if he took it. Just a few weeks into the invasion, though, his army began to suffer from the marchings imposed in the vast expanse of Russia, and logistical problems began to appear. Napoleonic armies lived on the land they crossed. They took harvests and all the resources they needed to keep moving without a heavy logistical system behind them. This worked very well in densely populated and fertile regions of Western Europe, but not well in Russia. All the more that the Russians used scorched earth tactics. They retreated and destroyed everything behind them, everything they couldn't take with them, so that Napoleon's army found no food, just burned villages and abandoned towns. Significant losses occurred because of this, and they were amplified by harassment from Russian light cavalry, more precisely Cossacks cavalry that fought on the side of Russia and could suddenly attack French columns before escaping thanks to their higher speed. 3 months after the beginning of the invasion, Napoleon reached the surroundings of Moscow. And at this point, the Russians felt compelled to engage for real. The clash took place in the vicinity of Moscow, at Borodino. The Russians had large human resources, and it showed. In total, 250,000 men were involved in this battle, which made the Battle of Borodino the largest and also bloodiest single-day action of the Napoleonic Wars. There were at least 70,000 casualties. The French captured the main positions on the battlefield, but they couldn't destroy the Russian army, which made the battle undecisive. The Russians could retreat orderly, but the road to Moscow was now open, and Napoleon took it. But once again, the city had been evacuated and set on fire. It was destroyed for a large part when the Grande Armée took control of it. The Tsar still refused to capitulate, leaving the war in limbo. Napoleon had more or less prevailed, but not destroyed the Russian army. And now the winter was approaching. In October, with no victory in sight and obviously unable to supply hundreds of thousands of men, Napoleon had to abandon Moscow and begin to retreat to where he came from. The following 2 months were an ordeal for his men. The cold, diseases, guerrilla attacks, and hunger, all this decimated the ranks, and the retreat turned into a complete disaster. When Napoleon finally escaped the Russian winter, only 27,000 men remained. Almost 400,000 were dead or missing, and 100,000 had been captured. a large part of his army had effectively ceased to exist by the end of 1812. In 6 months, he had fallen from strongman of Europe to emperor in distress. He left what remained of his troops and traveled as far as possible to Paris, because he knew that news of his defeat was traveling fast across Europe, and he had no shortage of humiliated enemies waiting for revenge. A sixth coalition was being hastily formed, and the climax of Napoleonic Wars fastly approaching. Russia and the United Kingdom were joined by Prussia, Sweden, and Austria, that all saw their best opportunity ever at finally putting an end to Napoleon's domination. In 1813, larger armies than ever were raised on the side of the Allies, hundreds of thousands of men, and ferocious fighting ensued across Europe. Napoleon would not go down without a fight. He kept winning battles and could slow down his enemies on their way to France, like at the battles of Lützen or Bautzen in Germany. But he couldn't be everywhere. Elsewhere, his generals lost engagements against mainly Russian, Austrian, and Prussian armies. Most of the time they were strongly outnumbered because the French army couldn't compensate for the losses of the Russian campaign. The biggest clash took place at the Battle of Leipzig in October 1813, also known as the Battle of the Nations. Over 4 days, Napoleon with 200,000 troops tried to repel 360,000 Allied troops of Russia, Austria, Prussia, and Sweden. He was outnumbered, and the Allies had learned from the previous years of warfare, making his tactics less and less effective. The French army, that also contained a lot of German and Polish soldiers, hence the name Battle of the Nations, was decisively beaten, and from this moment on, all hope of winning had gone for Napoleon. He would now prepare to defend France. His power in France was crumbling in 1813 and 14. I told you in previous parts how he had risen to power by obtaining support from the elite in France, the wealthier classes, because he guaranteed that the rights and properties they had acquired during the revolution would be preserved. But these people never signed for never-ending wars, including wars that could affect them personally. In the 1800s, when there were mobilizations of soldiers in France, people could pay to avoid being enrolled, and this meant that the sons of the bourgeoisie were not forced to go to war. Their parents could afford to spare them this risk. Napoleon needed so desperately to find soldiers and throw them into his battles that after the retreat from Russia, mobilization was extended to ever younger generations and made compulsory. It could no longer be escaped, which made him increasingly unpopular. The population in France understood that the war was lost long before he admitted it. At the beginning of 1814, 500,000 Allied soldiers were now entering France from all sides, and he had only 70,000 soldiers left. He opposed them as much as he could, and even won more battles in the Battle of France. But the gap in manpower could no longer be reduced, and his grip on France was fading away. In April 1814, faced with a hopeless situation, he decided to abdicate. The victors immediately exiled him to Elba, an island in the Mediterranean Sea. They restored the French Bourbon to the throne, with Louis XVIII, the 18th, a brother of Louis XVI, the guillotined king, and they initiated a congress in Vienna to redraw the map of Europe after all these years of turmoil. The emperor who had imposed his will for 15 years had now fallen. But not quite yet. Napoleon spent less than a year on Elba. In March 1815, he escaped and landed in the south of France. Then began the last chapter of his epic, a period called the 100 Days, because he managed to return to power and make his enemies sweat once more. He marched to Paris, picking support as he went. The recently restored Louis XVIII was not popular at all, because with him came back a lot of the old order, a threat to the liberal reforms of the revolution. Liberal here is not in the sense of left-wing that it often means in America today. It is in the sense of classical liberalism, which was also a basis of the American Republic and the French Revolution. That is to say, individual liberty, equality before the law, and consent of the governed. With little popular support, Louis XVIII had to escape again for the second time after his exile at the time of the Revolution. And Napoleon took back the reins of France. He could do it thanks for a large part to the unpopularity of the restored regime. Because he still had some popular support, but not the kind of enthusiasm he used to enjoy in the 1800s, especially from the bourgeoisie. The return of Napoleon was obviously synonymous with war for all his old enemies. So intense mobilizations resumed. But France was now vastly outnumbered at this point. Napoleon was able to raise 280,000 men. The allies of this new coalition, the Seventh Coalition, could field 700,000 and had plans for 1,000,000. Napoleon decided to strike first, as usual, and moved with a part of his army to Belgium, where the fate of his attempt at recreating his empire would be decided at the Battle of Waterloo. As you know, he lost it, and Waterloo was the last Napoleonic battle. He planned to eliminate a main British force commanded by Wellington before it could be helped by a Prussian army that was on the move. But Wellington was able to hold these positions long enough for the Prussians to arrive and to save the day. The battle was narrowly lost, and Napoleon had to return to Paris, where he realized that his situation was hopeless again. Hordes of Allied soldiers would overrun France again, and his own country no longer supported him. He abdicated for the second time, and this time the Allies would not let him escape. He was sent to his second and final exile to St. Helena in the southern Atlantic, where he died in 1821, aged 51. I already told you about various effects of Napoleonic Wars on Europe, and the world along the three parts of this story: the changes in societies, wars and independencies in America, the spread of liberalism, which is ambiguous because Napoleon at the same time spread political change and was an old-style dictator, but the reforms on administration, in laws, the promotion of nationalism, the independencies, the abolition of all systems he accomplished, all of this left marks well beyond France. In Spain, in Germany, in Italy, in Poland. They were the seeds of more changes to come in the 19th century. Even though the victors tried as much as possible to restore the old order, they couldn't recreate the pre-revolutionary absolutism of the previous century. For countries like Great Britain, Prussia, and Russia, the conclusion of Napoleonic Wars comforted their power. Great Britain had not suffered destruction on its soil, and it had dramatically increased its navy and global influence during the wars. Its industrial revolution was demultiplying its economic weight, paving the way for Great Britain to become the leading power of the 19th century. Prussia was able to get back everything it had lost because of Napoleon, and would be well placed to unify Germany several decades later. Russia had been the main contributor to victory on land, and it confirmed its rise to a great power status of the 18th century. France was obviously on the losing side, and after centuries of being the most populated country in Europe and attracting coalitions to keep it in check, it became just one power among others. The country had been drained of young men, and its frontiers put back to where they were in the early 1790s. In the 19th century, France no longer tried to expand in Europe like it did in previous centuries. It remained rather unstable politically until it finally became a republic 60 years later, and it turned for expansion to colonialism outside Europe. An unexpected effect of the 1815 peace was also to put an end to the repeated wars with England and later the United Kingdom. From this moment on, there would be ups and downs, but the two countries came closer together and ended turning into allies at the end of the century. Napoleonic Wars also changed warfare. Armies became way bigger than before, and they now moved on large-scale theaters. This way of going to war lasted until the Second World War. To give you an idea of the change of scale in the size of armies, before the French Revolution, European countries had armies of a few tens of thousands of men. France reached an army size of 1.5 million in the 1800s. Britain grew its army from 40,000 to 250,000 between 1793 and 1813. These large armies needed to be equipped, which stimulated mass production of armaments and the nascent industry in Western Europe. In 1840, the remains of Napoleon were returned to France, and since 1861 they are kept in a sarcophagus in the crypt of Les Invalides under the dome in the heart of Paris. This is where our journey ends for tonight, and we are now done with this story of Napoleon. Sleep well, or if you don't feel sleepy, you can pick another story from my library. I'll talk to you soon with another topic. Sweet dreams.